Hi again, and welcome to the fourth in my series of videos addressing the myths associated with landscape photography. And in this case I want to consider some of the views expressed on the use of filters. And the filters I'm going to consider neutral density filters, circular polarizers and neutral density graduated filters. And there is a suggestion among some people that filters are essential for landscape photography, and certainly for some types of landscape photography you will need sensors, particularly if we start off with neutral density filters. These are filters that don't impart any colour changes, they just simply cut down the amount of light going into the camera. So if you want to carry out a long exposure photograph, maybe of many minutes, then you can use a strong neutral density filter to cut the light down to increase the exposure time. So if you're taking pictures of moving clouds, flowing water, that can work very well, and there's no real convenient alternative to that. Now, the next class of filters are circular polarizers. Now, I think it's generally accepted that circular polarizers are really the only filters that you can't to some extent replicate in post-processing. And what circular polarizers do is they cut down scattered light, so they only allow light to pass through that is flowing in a particular direction. So if you have something like a sky with a lot of dust in and light scattering, they will cut the scatter down and they can increase the clarity and they can increase the color saturation. Also, if you're taking pictures of water, they can cut reflections off the surface of the water, and you're taking pictures of wet leaves and the light wet foliage, they can cut down this scattering of light and make the leaves clearer and give them more pop. Now, these are things you can't readily replicate in post-processing, and if you want those sorts of effects, then they can be very useful. So circular polarizer is widely regarded as essential for some types of landscape photography. But there is a caveat here that doesn't always get highlighted, and I'd like to stress here, is that polarizers work most effectively at 90 degrees from the sun. So if I point at the camera, if that's the sun, then the polarizer will work most effectively out to one side or the other, 90 degrees. And if you're looking to use a polarizer to boost colours in the sky, you need to be very careful if you're using an ultra wide angle lens. Because if you're using an ultra wide angle lens with a really extreme, say really extreme field of view, then you are going from the centre, say, of the sun out to 90 degrees each side. Well, you're going to cover a good deal of that, maybe 120 degrees with some ultra wide angle lenses. And so what you'll see is the polarization effect will vary across your scene. And if that happens, you can get very marked and quite nasty looking dark blue bands in your sky. So certainly, personally, I wouldn't use circular polarizers simply to adjust the colour in the sky. That is one aspect of what they do that you probably can equally well replicate in post-processing. So circular polarizers, probably very valuable for some types, but not all types of landscape photography. Now the final and probably the most contentious is ND graduated filters. So this, like a neutral density filter, is a filter that cuts down light, but it only cuts down light across part of the scene. And there is a gradation from dark filtering to no filtering, and you get hard and sharp grads where that transition is either a very sharp edge or a very diffuse edge. And the idea is that the neutral density graduated filter can be used to cut down the light coming from the brightest areas of the scene, usually the sky. So if you have a scene with a very wide dynamic range, you can compress a dynamic range by using a neutral density graduated filter. Now, there are some problems with neutral density graduated filters. If you have something like a tree or a mountain protruding into the sky, then the neutral density graduated filter will tend to darken that as well as the sky itself. So you will still have some post-processing corrections to do, but they are widely used. Less widely used than they were though, because as more and more people become familiar with exposure blending and luminosity masking, a lot of people find it more convenient to take pictures at a range of different exposures and then blend them together in post-processing. So that has some advantages over a neutral density graduated filter. It also has some disadvantages in that if things are moving in the scene, then the bracketing approach will tend to pick up those movements, and that can degrade the image. So it comes down pretty much to personal choice, but bear in mind that a good quality set of ND graduated filters is going to be several £100s. It can be a fairly expensive way forward. Now, the other thing about neutral density graduated filters is there's a few myths floating around about exposure. And back probably 15 years ago, a concept came forward called ETTR, exposed to the right. And the idea of this was that when you took your image, you should adjust your histogram such that the brightest tones in the image, and this is the important bit, the brightest tones in the image that were important to the image are right as far as you can go to the right hand side of the histogram without actually blowing out the highlights. Now I stress the important to the image bit here because this is where a misconception comes in. Some people consider ETTR to be exposed to the absolute highlights. Now, give an example. You're shooting into the sun on a foggy morning. The fog is reasonably dense, but it's not completely masking the sky. You're getting a nice ethereal look to some of the tree branches. You've got some reasonably bright areas of sky, but you've got some dark shadows, and you want to maximize your dynamic range. Simple fact is you will not be able to include the center of the sun, even with mist in that. If you try to do that, then other areas of the scene will be drastically underexposed. So you have, in situations like that, to decide what is the most important area with the highest highlights and set that to be the highest point on your histogram. That will blow out the center of the sun, but nobody looks at the sun and nobody would regard it as looking unusual or wrong if the center of the sun was blown out in an image. Now, the reason I stress that importance is because people are now starting to say, exposed to the right doesn't matter. Particularly with reference to Sony cameras, people are saying, I don't need to do it because my Sonys are so good at retaining or pulling out, allowing me to pull up the shadows. And that is a fundamental misconception. Sure, the Sony cameras are very good at lifting the shadows, but that's not the point. The point is, every stop you underexpose your image will cut down the light by 50%. And the light is carrying the information your sensor is collecting. So if you're underexposed by one stop, you cut out 50% of the information. Underexposed by two stops, you're cutting out 50% and then another 50%. So you've cut out 75% and so on. So no matter how good your camera is at pulling up the shadows, the point is you are cutting out information if you underexpose. And if you underexpose by not getting your exposure absolutely right, and then you use an ND grad when you're working at your exposure, things get even worse. So exposure, maximizing your exposure is critical whether or not you use an ND grad. And I don't use ND grads now, and the simple reason is that when I first bought the set of ND grads I had, and I didn't fortunately buy the most expensive set, I had a Nikon D200 camera, and that camera had about 3 stops less dynamic range than the camera I use now, and the ND graduated filters that I had were 3 stops ND. So my modern camera will give me as much dynamic range now as my old D200 would have given me with a 3-stop ND graduated filter. On top of that, I'm now more experienced. I now have a better handle on how to set optimal exposure, and that probably gives me another couple of stops. And you couple that with the improvements in post-processing software, which probably gives you another stop. And I'm probably now about 4 or 5 stops better off than I was with my old D200. And compare that with 3-stop ND graduated filter, that effect is far more significant. Now, of course, if I used an ND graduated filter with my current cameras, I would again get an additional benefit. But that has to be traded off against cost and inconvenience. And because the opportunities I have to take photos mainly require that I don't take a tripod, I'm looking to maximise the light coming through the lens, not to start cutting it down with filters. So for me, ND graduated filters don't work. If I have to try to capture a high dynamic range scene, I will bracket. I don't do it very often, and that for that very reason, it's more cost effective to use bracketing than to buy an expensive set of filters. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't use filters. What I'm saying is, if you're starting out, filters shouldn't be a priority. They are an expense. You'd probably be better off initially putting that money into better lenses. They are an inconvenience, and they are a complication. If you're struggling with all the other aspects of landscape photography, that's one you can leave behind. The problem I have is there are some, again, it comes down to relatively inexperienced YouTube creators who start off by pontificating on using manual settings and using a filter for everything. And I think, as much as anything, that unintentionally describes the lack of depth of appreciation, and it also reflects a desire to appear to be competent or professional, in inverted commas. And that gets in the way of actually saying what is important. And if you look at YouTube, you look at the successful landscape photographers with very large followings, producing very good pictures, an awful lot of them are moving away, certainly from using ND graduated filters. So it's by no means an absolute requirement. So have a play, yet again, with the camera you've got. Look at maximising the dynamic range. Try looking up the details exposed to the right and see how much detail in the shadows your camera can pull out. One of the problems with pulling out details in shadows is that you can magnify noise. But with all the modern AI software coming through now with noise reduction, it really isn't too much of a problem to get rid of noise. So again, it's well worth trying. So I hope you enjoyed the video again. Thank you very much for watching, and once again, goodbye.